Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1839, and Charleston stood as a jewel of the South, its cobblestone streets lined with grand homes that hid terrible secrets behind ornate iron gates. Among these prestigious addresses on East Bay Street stood the Harrington residence, a three-story Federal-style mansion overlooking Charleston Harbor. From the outside, the white columns and manicured garden presented an image of Southern prosperity. Few knew of the darkness that festered within those walls, a darkness that would eventually consume the merchant's son, Elijah Harrington. On the evening of September 18, 1839, Elijah Harrington was reported missing by his father, William Harrington, a prominent cotton merchant whose ships regularly sailed between Charleston and Liverpool. The disappearance came just 3 days after the mysterious departure of 12 enslaved persons from the Harrington plantation outside the city. What initially appeared as two separate incidents would later reveal themselves as threads of the same disturbing tapestry. According to the Charleston Mercury's archives, William Harrington offered a substantial reward of $500 for information about his son's whereabouts. The newspaper announcement described Elijah as a gentleman of 27 years, tall in stature, with auburn hair and a distinctive birthmark beneath his right eye. What the announcement failed to mention was the bitter dispute that had erupted between father and son just weeks before the disappearance. The Harrington name carried considerable weight in Charleston society. Their wealth, accumulated over 3 generations, began with Elijah's grandfather, Thomas Harrington, who arrived from Bristol, England, in 1785. The family archives, preserved at the Charleston Historical Society, indicate that Thomas started with a single ship and gradually expanded his fleet through shrewd investments and strategic marriages. By the time William took control of the family business in 1818, Harrington Mercantile controlled nearly 15% of Charleston's cotton exports. William Harrington was known as a stern, calculating businessman. His portrait, which hung in the entrance hall of the East Bay Street mansion, showed a man with penetrating gray eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual frown. Associates described him as exacting in all matters and not given to displays of sentiment. His marriage to Elizabeth Pinckney, daughter of another established Charleston family, was widely understood to be a business arrangement rather than a love match. Elizabeth died giving birth to Elijah in 1812, leaving William to raise his only son alone. According to household staff who later gave statements to investigators, William viewed Elijah not as a son to be loved, but as an heir to be molded. From the age of 5, Elijah was expected to sit in on business meetings. By 12, he was required to keep ledgers and correspond with trading partners. His education was focused entirely on commerce, mathematics, and languages useful for international trade. Records from the College of Charleston indicate that Elijah enrolled in 1828, but withdrew after just 1 term. A letter from William to the college president, discovered in the university archives in 1962, expressed disappointment in the curriculum, which he felt included too many frivolous subjects unsuited to a future merchant. Elijah's formal education continued under private tutors selected by his father. This controlled upbringing appears to have created in Elijah a deep, unspoken resentment. A former tutor, Jonathan Merrill, wrote in his personal memoirs that the young man carried himself with perfect composure, yet one sensed a storm beneath the still waters. Merrill noted Elijah's particular interest in literature that his father deemed wasteful: poetry, novels, and especially accounts of far-off places like the Caribbean islands. The first indication of serious conflict between father and son appears in the records of the First Bank of Charleston from early 1838. William Harrington established a separate account for Elijah, with a modest monthly allowance, a standard arrangement for young men of their class. However, bank records show that William frequently reviewed his son's expenditures and more than once closed accounts that Elijah had opened without his knowledge. During this period, Charleston was experiencing significant economic and social tensions. The Panic of 1837 had destabilized many fortunes, though the Harringtons weathered it better than most due to their diverse investments. The city's population included a substantial number of free black residents alongside the white elite and the enslaved population. The Denmark-Vesey Conspiracy of 1822 had left the white population perpetually fearful of uprising, resulting in increasingly harsh restrictions and patrols. The Harrington Plantation, located 10 miles outside Charleston proper along the Ashley River, was home to approximately 40 enslaved individuals who produced rice and cotton. Plantation ledgers, partially recovered after the fire of 1840, reveal William's methodical approach to human ownership. Each person was listed with an assigned value, productivity metrics, and notes on behavior. According to these records, William rarely visited the plantation himself, preferring to leave its management to an overseer named Thomas Blackwood. Correspondence between Blackwood and William, preserved in the state archives, focuses almost exclusively on production quotas and disciplinary measures. The enslaved people are referred to only by first names or sometimes just by numbers, corresponding to their assigned cabins. It was against this background that Elijah Harrington first met Margaret Thornton in the spring of 1839. The circumstances of their meeting are documented in Margaret's diary, which describes an encounter at Nathaniel Russell's bookshop on King Street. Elijah was apparently selecting volumes on Cuban geography when he overheard Margaret discussing poetry with the proprietor. "A gentleman interrupted our conversation today," Margaret wrote on April 3, 1839. "He spoke with such enthusiasm about Mr. Byron's works that Mr. Russell introduced us. Mr. H. has the most peculiar eyes, almost amber in color, and speaks with a refinement one rarely encounters even among Charleston's best families." Margaret Thornton's background stands in sharp contrast to Elijah's. Her father, James Thornton, worked as a clerk for the harbor master's office, a respectable but decidedly middle-class position. The Thorntons lived in a modest two-story house on Queen Street, and Margaret had been educated at the Charleston Female Seminary, where she developed her love of literature and music. Subsequent diary entries track the development of their relationship. Initial meetings at the bookshop gave way to accidental encounters at White Point Garden, where couples often promenaded on Sunday afternoons. By May, Margaret wrote of receiving notes delivered by Elijah's personal servant, a man named Solomon. "Solomon brought another message today," reads her entry from May 12th. "He seems nervous when he comes to our door, though I have assured him my father is at his office until late evening. Mr. H. writes that he must speak with me on a matter of great importance. We are to meet tomorrow at St. Philip's after morning service." The matter of great importance appears to have been Elijah's first declaration of his feelings. Margaret's account of this meeting reveals both his passion and his awareness of the social barriers between them. Mr. H. Elijah, as he now asks me to call him, spoke today of feelings I scarcely dared hope he harbored. He acknowledges the differences in our situations, but claims they mean nothing to him. When I reminded him that such differences mean everything in Charleston, he replied that perhaps Charleston need not be our home forever. He spoke of Cuba and its verdant mountains with such longing that I could almost see them myself. What neither of them knew at this point was that William Harrington had already begun negotiations with the Caldwell family regarding a potential marriage between Elijah and Josephine Caldwell. The Caldwells owned significant shipping interests in New Orleans and had recently expanded to Havana, precisely the connection William sought to strengthen his trading network. Court records from July 1839 include the formal engagement agreement between the families with a wedding date set for October 15th. The document includes detailed provisions regarding dowry, property transfers, and business arrangements. Josephine Caldwell is mentioned only as the daughter, with no reference to her personal qualities or preferences. According to testimony later given by the Harrington family's butler, William informed Elijah of the engagement at dinner on July 22nd. The butler reported that Elijah received the news in silence, excused himself from the table, and departed the house. He did not return for 2 days, during which time William made no effort to locate him. It was shortly after this incident that Elijah's diary entries begin to outline his desperate plan. The earliest reference appears on July 30th. Father has made his move. I am to be married, sold, more accurately, to cement the Havana connection. The irony does not escape me that the place M and I dreamed of as our refuge is to become my prison, unless I act. Subsequent entries become increasingly specific. On August 4th, he wrote, "Met with SM today. He assures me the transactions can be arranged with utmost discretion, though the price he names for his services is considerable. I find I do not flinch at the cost, either in gold or in the other, less tangible currency such dealings extract from a man's character." The SM referenced is Silas Mercer, whose presence in Charleston's history is both significant and deliberately obscured. City directories list him as an import-export agent, but contemporary accounts suggest his business extended well beyond legitimate commerce. His office near the Old Exchange was known to those involved in the domestic slave trade, though he maintained a respectable facade for public consumption. A sworn statement given to authorities by Mercer's clerk after his death confirms that Elijah visited the office at least 6 times between August and September 1839. The clerk, who requested anonymity for fear of reprisals, stated that Elijah and Mercer always spoke privately, but that he observed documents changing hands. Mr. Harrington the younger would arrive with papers bearing his father's seal, the clerk testified. After their meetings, Mr. Mercer would dispatch me to various contacts throughout the city. I carried messages but was instructed never to examine their contents. The scheme that emerged from these meetings was audacious in its complexity. According to ledgers recovered from Mercer's office, Elijah began by identifying 12 enslaved individuals from his father's plantation who would fetch the highest prices, primarily men and women between the ages of 18 and 30 with specialized skills. Using forged documents bearing his father's signature, he transferred ownership to himself. This transfer would normally have been impossible to accomplish without William's knowledge, but 2 factors worked in Elijah's favor. First, William's business interests had recently expanded to include potential railroad investments, taking his attention away from day-to-day operations. Second, the plantation overseer, Thomas Blackwood, had been replaced in late July following a dispute with William over plantation management. The new overseer, James Wilson, was unfamiliar with William's signature and standard procedures. Records indicate that when presented with documents supposedly from his employer, Wilson did not question their authenticity. The selected individuals were transported to Charleston under the pretense of being reassigned to work in the Harrington warehouses. Once in Charleston, they were held briefly in a storage facility near the docks before being sold through Mercer's network of contacts to buyers from Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. The transactions were deliberately spread across multiple buyers to avoid drawing attention to the unusual volume of sales from a single source. The proceeds from these sales, totaling approximately $9,600, a substantial sum in 1839, were held by Mercer until Elijah's final preparations were complete. Mercer's commission of 20% reduced Elijah's available funds to approximately $7,680, which he withdrew from Mercer's safe on September 17th, 1 day before his disappearance. While Elijah was executing this plan, his relationship with Margaret Thornton continued to develop, though with increasing secrecy. Her diary entries from August show growing concern about their future. Elijah speaks more urgently of our departure with each meeting. Today he asked if I could be ready to leave Charleston on a day's notice. When I asked about my father, how could I abandon him without explanation? Elijah assured me we would send for him once we were established elsewhere. I find myself both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect. What Margaret did not record, but what later evidence suggests, is that Elijah never shared with her the true source of the funds that would finance their escape. Her diary contains no mention of the enslaved people sold to secure their future, no indication that she understood the moral compromise at the heart of their planned freedom. The last confirmed meeting between Elijah and Margaret took place on September 16th, just 2 days before his reported disappearance. They met at the Charleston Hotel, where Elijah had taken a private dining room under the name Mr. Edwards. According to the waiter who attended them, the couple spoke in hushed tones throughout the meal, with the lady appearing agitated and at one point dabbing tears from her eyes. What became clear from later investigations is that this meeting did not proceed as Elijah had planned. Margaret's diary, which ends abruptly on September 16th, contains a final disturbing entry. I cannot reconcile the man I believed him to be with what he has revealed today. When pressed, he spoke of necessary sacrifices and transactions. With such coldness, I scarcely recognized him. When I asked directly about the source of our travel funds, his answer confirmed my worst fears. I told him I could not build happiness on such a foundation. His expression changed then. Something dark passed behind his eyes. He said I would come to understand that there are no clean hands in Charleston. I left before dessert was served, though he called after me. I will write to him tomorrow once my thoughts are clearer. No such letter has ever been found. What is known is that Margaret Thornton returned to her home on Queen Street that evening. According to her father's subsequent statement to authorities, she appeared withdrawn at breakfast the following morning, but went about her usual routine. She mentioned plans to visit a friend on Trad Street in the afternoon. Margaret never arrived at her friend's home. She was last seen by a neighbor walking toward White Point Garden around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on September 17th. The neighbor reported that she was wearing a blue dress and carrying a small reticule, and appeared to be in no distress. That same afternoon, Elijah Harrington made his final preparations. Bank records confirm his withdrawal of $8,000 in gold coins, slightly more than the amount he had received from Mercer, suggesting he had supplemented the funds from his personal accounts. He then returned to the Harrington home on East Bay Street, where, according to household staff, he spent several hours in his father's study while William was attending a Chamber of Commerce meeting. When William returned home that evening, nothing appeared amiss. Father and son dined together, with the butler later recalling that the conversation was minimal, but not unusually so. Elijah retired to his rooms around 9 o'clock. The following morning, his bed was found undisturbed, and his wardrobe showed signs of careful selection. Specific items of clothing had been removed, while others remained. Most tellingly, a small portrait of his mother, which he kept on his bedside table, was missing, along with his personal journal and a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. A note on his desk, addressed to his father, contained just 3 words, "I choose differently." William Harrington initially treated his son's absence as a temporary rebellion. It was only when he received word from the plantation that 12 enslaved workers were unaccounted for that he began to suspect a more significant breach. His first action was not to report either situation to authorities, but to summon his longtime solicitor, Frederick Pinckney. Pinckney's detailed records, discovered among his papers after his death in 1859, provide insight into the initial investigation. Pinckney dispatched agents to the docks, where they learned that several ships had departed Charleston on the morning of September 18th, including vessels bound for Savannah, Havana, and New Orleans. At William's direction, Pinckney also made discreet inquiries about Margaret Thornton. It is unclear how William knew of her connection to Elijah, though household staff later suggested that Solomon, Elijah's personal servant, had been interrogated and may have revealed information about the messages he had carried. The fate of Solomon himself represents another disturbing aspect of this case. According to the household account books, Solomon was sold just 1 week after Elijah's disappearance. The entry simply notes S, transferred to trader for market value without specifying the buyer or destination. This hasty disposal of someone who might have held valuable information suggests William's desire to eliminate potential witnesses to his son's activities. It was only after learning of Margaret's concurrent disappearance that William contacted authorities, presenting the situation as a straightforward case of a missing family member. The constables assigned to the case began by interviewing the Thornton household, where they learned that Margaret had not returned home on the evening of the 17th. James Thornton, apparently unaware of his daughter's relationship with Elijah Harrington, expressed shock when informed of the possible connection. His statement to authorities emphasized Margaret's sensible nature and strong moral character. He mentioned that she had recently acquired several new dresses and books that he had assumed were purchased with her modest savings from teaching music to neighboring families. The initial theory adopted by investigators was that Elijah and Margaret had eloped, perhaps to avoid William's disapproval of a match beneath his son's station. This narrative was convenient for all concerned. It protected the Harrington reputation while providing hope to James Thornton that his daughter was safe, if somewhat imprudent in her actions. This theory began to unravel on September 25th, when Thomas Wilson, the new plantation overseer, arrived in Charleston with disturbing news. A routine inventory had revealed not just the absence of 12 enslaved workers, but also missing documentation from the plantation office. Wilson, concerned about being held responsible, had conducted a thorough search and discovered fragments of burned papers in the office fireplace. Among these fragments was a corner of a document bearing what appeared to be William Harrington's signature, though Wilson now suspected it might be a forgery. When shown examples of both William's and Elijah's handwriting, Wilson indicated that the signature more closely resembled Elijah's attempt to mimic his father's hand. This discovery shifted the investigation from a case of elopement to one of theft and fraud. William Harrington, now facing not just the loss of his son, but also valuable property and potential damage to his business reputation, pressed authorities to expand their search. The trail led quickly to Silas Mercer. Several dock workers, when questioned about recent unusual transactions, mentioned seeing Elijah in Mercer's company on multiple occasions. Given Mercer's reputation in certain circles, this connection immediately suggested to investigators that the missing enslaved people had likely been sold. Constables arrived at Mercer's office on October 1st to find it locked and apparently abandoned. Breaking down the door, they discovered evidence of hasty departure, drawers left open, papers scattered, and a cold cup of tea on the desk. Most significantly, the office safe stood open and empty. For nearly 2 weeks, city authorities searched for Mercer without success. Then, on October 12th, a client arriving for an appointment found the office unlocked and Mercer seated at his desk, apparently dead for several hours. The coroner's report cited failure of the heart, though modern analysis suggests poison as a more likely cause. The most incriminating evidence, the ledger detailing transactions between Mercer and Elijah, was found open on the desk, but with several pages clearly torn out. The remaining entries provided enough information to confirm that Elijah had indeed arranged the sale of his father's property through Mercer's agency, but details of the buyers' identities and destinations were lost. An important detail from the coroner's examination, often overlooked in accounts of the case, was the discovery of a small vial in Mercer's coat pocket. The vial, which contained traces of a substance later identified as arsenic, bore a label from Whitaker's Apothecary, an establishment where Elijah Harrington was known to be a regular customer. While this circumstantial evidence was never sufficient to formally accuse Elijah of murder, it added another layer of darkness to his disappearance. What is particularly unsettling about this phase of the investigation is the shift in William Harrington's approach. According to Pinckney's records, William became less concerned with locating Elijah than with tracing the missing enslaved individuals, whom he referred to in correspondence as my property, fraudulently disposed of. The reward offered for information about his son remained in place, but William now offered an additional $1,000 for information, leading to the recovery of absconded property. This change in focus raised questions about William's true priorities. A letter from Pinckney to a contact in Savannah hints at the complex motivations. Mr. H speaks of justice, but I suspect his concern lies more with the financial loss and potential damage to his standing. The boy has struck at the heart of the father's identity, his reputation as a man whose word and signature are beyond question. The investigation took another turn in early November with the discovery of a body in Charleston Harbor. The deceased was initially identified as a woman in her 20s, dressed in the remains of a blue dress. Given Margaret's last known clothing, authorities briefly suspected they had found her remains. However, further examination revealed the woman to be unknown to Charleston residents, possibly a passenger from a ship recently arrived from Liverpool. This false alarm had a profound effect on James Thornton. His statement to authorities following the incident reveals his deteriorating hope. I have prayed that Margaret fled with young Harrington, however misguided such an action would be, for the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. Yet as days become weeks, I find my prayers changing. I now ask only to know her fate, whatever it may be. The investigation continued through the fall of 1839, with inquiries sent to port cities along the Atlantic coast and throughout the Caribbean. A potentially significant lead emerged in December when a ship's captain reported having transported a gentleman matching Elijah's description from Savannah to Havana in late September. The captain recalled the passenger traveling alone and paying his fare in gold coins rather than the more common banknotes. This information aligned with a report from Savannah authorities who had identified an individual named E. Thornhill staying at the Pulaski House Hotel from September 19th to 22nd. Hotel records indicated that Mr. Thornhill had arrived alone, but departed with a female companion whose name was not recorded. The hotel staff, when questioned, recalled only that the woman appeared uncommonly quiet and remained in their room throughout their stay. The months that followed brought no resolution. Authorities in Savannah, New Orleans, and Havana reported no further sightings of either Elijah or Margaret. The 12 enslaved individuals sold through Mercer's network had vanished into the vast domestic slave trade, their new locations impossible to trace without Mercer's complete records. William Harrington, his health visibly affected by the scandal, withdrew increasingly from public life. The Charleston Mercury noted his absence from the St. Cecilia Society's annual ball in January 1840, an event the Harringtons had attended without fail for generations. Business associates reported that he conducted affairs primarily through written correspondence, rarely leaving his East Bay Street home. A letter from William to his sister in Philadelphia, dated December 1839 and later preserved in her family archives, offers a rare glimpse into his state of mind. The boy has dealt me a blow more grievous than any business reversal, not merely in the substantial financial loss, but in the manner of it. To use my name, my signature, the very instruments by which I have built our fortune, against me. I cannot decide which pains me more, his betrayal or the possibility that I never truly knew him at all. It was in this atmosphere of unresolved tension that the mysterious package arrived at the Harrington residence in January 1840. Delivered by a sailor who claimed to have received it in Havana with instructions to bring it to Charleston, the package contained a leather-bound journal. The sailor could provide no information about its origins beyond saying that a gentleman with unusual amber eyes had paid him well for its delivery. According to household staff, William spent an entire night in his study after receiving the package. The butler reported hearing strange sounds, not quite weeping, but a sound I had never before heard from the master, something between rage and grief. The following morning, William summoned Pinckney and instructed him to cease all efforts to locate Elijah. The contents of this journal remained unknown until 1961, when it surfaced in a collection of Harrington family papers donated to the University of South Carolina. Authentication confirmed it to be written in Elijah's hand, with entries dating from July through September 1839. The journal reveals a young man caught between desperate love and calculating pragmatism. Early entries focus on his feelings for Margaret and his resentment of his father's control. Father believes everything and everyone has its price. He has negotiated my life as he would a shipment of cotton, seeking maximum return on his investment in raising me. The Caldwell girl means nothing to me, but to him she represents the New Orleans and Havana connections he has long coveted. I am simply the vessel for his ambitions. As the entries progress, Elijah's plan takes shape with disturbing clarity. SM assures me the transactions can be arranged discreetly. The price he names is considerable, but freedom, both theirs and mine, comes at a cost. I find it grimly amusing that I will use the very system Father reveres to break free of him. The 12 I have selected will, in their sale, purchase my liberty. Father would appreciate the economic elegance, if nothing else. What is most chilling about the journal is Elijah's apparent inability to recognize the moral contradiction in his actions. While he rails against his father's treatment of him as property to be traded for business advantage, he shows no comparable concern for those whose actual sale would finance his escape. The journal also reveals Elijah's detailed research into Cuba as a destination. Several pages contain notes on Havana's business environment, prominent families, and the legal system, particularly regarding property rights and the ease with which foreign merchants could establish themselves. He notes that Spanish authorities are amenable to arrangements that benefit their interests, and that, with sufficient capital, one can secure both position and privacy. The final entries take a darker turn, suggesting that Elijah's plans had met an unexpected obstacle. M has revealed herself to be less pragmatic than I believed. When told of the arrangements, she reacted with shock rather than gratitude. Her concerns for those poor souls show a naivety about the world we inhabit. No one in Charleston has clean hands, not the merchants, not the ministers, certainly not the ladies who claim moral superiority while wearing cotton, picked by those they pretend not to see. The last entry, dated September 17th, contains the most disturbing passage. M has forced my hand. Her threat to expose my actions leaves me no choice but to accelerate our departure. She will understand in time that I acted for both our benefits. Some freedoms must be taken rather than granted. By this time tomorrow, we will be at sea, bound for Havana and the new life I have purchased for us. She may resist initially, but I am confident that once removed from Charleston's influence, her perspective will align with reality. This final entry strongly suggests that Elijah intended to take Margaret with him regardless of her consent. Whether this plan involved persuasion, deception, or force remains unclear, but the implications cast his disappearance, and hers, in a far more sinister light. The journal provides no information about Elijah's actions after September 17th. The gap between his written intentions and the eventual outcome represents one of the most troubling aspects of the case. In February 1840, William Harrington took a series of actions that effectively erased Elijah from the family history. Legal documents filed with the Charleston County Court formally disowned his son and removed him from all inheritance. William revised his will to distribute his considerable estate among distant relatives and selected charitable institutions. Most tellingly, he ordered Elijah's portrait removed from the family gallery and his name struck from the family Bible. Contemporaneous with these actions came the mysterious fire at the Harrington Plantation House. The blaze, which began in the evening of April 10, 1840, completely destroyed the main house and office. The plantation overseer's report, preserved in county records, attributes the fire to a lamp overturned in the study, though several witnesses later questioned this explanation. The timing of the fire raised suspicions, particularly as it coincided with increased scrutiny from authorities regarding the documentation of the missing enslaved individuals. With the plantation records destroyed, any remaining evidence of Elijah's forgeries was lost, effectively ending the official investigation. A detail rarely mentioned in accounts of the fire concerns the fate of James Wilson, the overseer who had first raised concerns about the forged documents. According to county employment records, Wilson was dismissed from his position just 3 days before the fire. His subsequent whereabouts remain unknown, though a James Wilson appears in the 1850 census for Savannah, Georgia, listed as a shipping agent with considerable property, a curious rise in fortune for a former plantation overseer. For nearly 2 decades, the story of Elijah Harrington faded from public memory. William continued his business with diminished vigor, eventually passing away in 1857. His funeral, according to the Charleston Mercury's account, was well attended by business associates, but notably lacking in family mourners. The case might have remained closed had it not been for the discovery made in 1859 by an American diplomat stationed in Havana. In correspondence with a colleague in Washington, later published in the Diplomatic Service Archives, he mentioned encountering a most curious situation involving an American expatriate. The diplomat, James Calloway, described meeting a successful merchant named Edward Thornhill at a reception hosted by the Spanish governor. Thornhill had established a prosperous trading house specializing in luxury goods imported from Europe and distributed throughout the Caribbean. Mr. Thornhill presents himself as a native of Virginia, Calloway wrote, though his accent suggests the Carolinas to my ear. He appears to have arrived in Cuba some 20 years ago and rapidly established himself in business. His connections with Spanish officials are surprisingly extensive for an American, and his home in the Vedado district is said to be one of the most elegant in Havana. Calloway's initial interest in Thornhill was purely professional. He was seeking information about American business interests in Cuba for a diplomatic report. However, his curiosity was piqued during a dinner at Thornhill's villa, where he observed several peculiarities about his host and particularly about Mrs. Thornhill. The lady of the house presents a curious case, Calloway noted. She is handsome, perhaps 40 years of age, and clearly well educated in the social graces required of her position. Yet there is something disquieting in her manner. She speaks rarely, and then only when directly addressed by her husband. On those occasions when I attempted to engage her in conversation about literature or music, topics on which ladies of her station are generally eager to discourse, she deferred immediately to Mr. Thornhill. This observation led to discreet inquiries that revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Household staff interviewed by Calloway's Cuban contacts reported that Mrs. Thornhill never received visitors alone and rarely left the property without her husband. Most troublingly, servants mentioned that she had arrived in the household not as a bride, but as a companion purchased by Thornhill shortly after his arrival in Cuba. Calloway's most significant finding came through a conversation with an elderly Spanish priest who had served the expatriate community in Havana since the 1830s. The priest recalled performing a marriage ceremony for Thornhill in early 1840, but expressed reservations about the bride's circumstances. The good father confided that the woman who was introduced as Isabel appeared to be in a state of considerable distress, Calloway wrote. When he inquired as to her willingness to enter the Union, Thornhill answered on her behalf, explaining that she spoke little Spanish or English. The priest, though uncomfortable with the arrangement, proceeded with the ceremony under pressure from a Spanish official who accompanied the couple. Further investigation uncovered marriage records from 1840 between Edward Thornhill and a woman identified only as Isabel, described as previously in service, with no surname provided, a common designation for those who had been enslaved. The timing aligned perfectly with Elijah Harrington's disappearance from Charleston. Calloway's most disturbing discovery came from a conversation with Thornhill's gardener, who claimed that Thornhill kept a private room in their villa that his wife was forbidden to enter. According to the gardener, the room contained a portrait of a young woman who resembled Mrs. Thornhill, but was clearly not the same person, along with various items including books of English poetry and a silver pocket watch. Based on these findings, Calloway developed a theory that Edward Thornhill was, in fact, Elijah Harrington, and that the woman living as his wife was not Margaret Thornton, but someone chosen for her resemblance to Margaret. This theory gained credibility when Calloway learned that Thornhill's business connections included several of the Spanish officials implicated in the illegal slave trade between Cuba and the American South. Of particular interest was Thornhill's relationship with a Spanish customs official named Rodriguez, who was known to facilitate the entry of enslaved people into Cuba despite the increasing international pressure against the trade. According to Calloway's informants, Thornhill and Rodriguez maintained a close business relationship that extended beyond official commerce. Calloway's investigation was cut short when he was recalled to Washington following a diplomatic incident unrelated to the Thornhill case. His final report includes a disturbing speculation. I have come to suspect that Harrington, now living as Thornhill, used a portion of his ill-gotten funds not just to establish his business here, but to purchase a woman who could, with appropriate clothing and instruction, pass as Margaret Thornton in the eyes of casual acquaintances. The real Miss Thornton, I fear, may have met a fate too dark to contemplate when she rejected his plan. This theory gained additional support in 1964 when researchers at the University of Havana discovered ship manifests from October 1839, showing the arrival of a passenger matching Elijah's description, traveling under the name Edward Thornhill. The manifest lists him as traveling alone, with no companion matching Margaret's description. More telling still was the discovery of customs records indicating that Thornhill imported a household servant from New Orleans in December 1839, just 3 months after his arrival in Cuba. The description of this individual is minimal, noting only female, age approximately 25, fair complexion. The timing and description align with Calloway's theory that Elijah Thornhill acquired a woman who could be transformed into a facsimile of Margaret. The question of Margaret Thornton's fate remained unanswered until a grim discovery in 1965. During renovations to St. Philip's Church Cemetery in Charleston, workers uncovered an unmarked grave near the section reserved for the Thornton family plot. Forensic examination of the remains indicated a female in her early 20s with evidence of a head injury consistent with blunt force trauma. While it was impossible to conclusively identify the remains as Margaret's, the location and estimated time of burial, late 1839, aligned with her disappearance. More telling was the discovery of a small reticule buried with the body, containing a cameo brooch that James Thornton had identified in his original statement as belonging to his daughter. The cemetery records from St. Philip's Church include an entry for a Margaret Thornton buried in November 1839, with the cause of death listed as fever. This official explanation appears to have been accepted without question at the time, possibly due to the influence of William Harrington, who may have sought to suppress any investigation that might further implicate his son. A disturbing footnote to this aspect of the case emerged in 1967, when researchers examining medical records from the period discovered a payment from William Harrington to Dr. Joseph Blackwell, a physician known for his discretion among Charleston's elite families. The payment, significantly larger than standard medical fees of the time, was made on October 18, 1839, exactly 1 month after Elijah's disappearance and during the period when Margaret's whereabouts were unknown. Dr. Sear. Blackwell's personal journal, preserved in the Medical University of South Carolina archives, contains a cryptic entry dated October 17th. Called to examine deceased female. Circumstances troubling. Will comply with family wishes regarding certificate. While the entry does not specifically name Margaret Thornton, the timing corresponds precisely with the period of her disappearance. The last confirmed record of Edward Thornhill appears in a Havana business directory from 1868. His trading company is listed, but a notation indicates it was under new management. No death record has ever been found, nor any indication of what became of his wife or his considerable fortune. A partial answer came in 1966 when historians researching American expatriates in Mexico discovered records of an Edward Thornhill purchasing property near Mérida, Yucatan, in 1869. The notarial records describe Thornhill as approximately 50 years of age, formerly of Havana, accompanied by wife Isabel. Property tax records show the estate remaining in Thornhill's name until 1882, after which it transferred to I. Thornhill, widow. In 1965, during renovations to the old Thornton family home on Queen Street in Charleston, workers discovered a small cavity in the wall of what had been Margaret's bedroom. Inside was a sealed jar containing a lock of auburn hair tied with a black ribbon. Attached was a note in faded ink that read simply, "Remember me, E.H." The jar and its contents were donated to the Charleston Museum, where they remained on display until 1968. When a descendant of the Thornton family requested their removal. The curator's notes indicate that the descendant appeared visibly shaken upon viewing the exhibit and insisted the items be properly buried in the Thornton family plot. In a final strange footnote to this case, the Charleston Historical Society received an anonymous donation in 1968, a small wooden box containing gold coins minted in 1839. With a value equivalent to the amount Elijah Harrington withdrew before his disappearance. Accompanying the coins was a note written in a shaky hand, "Return what was taken." The identity of the sender was never determined, though the postmark indicated the package had been mailed from Mérida, Mexico. The story of Elijah Harrington represents one of the darkest chapters in Charleston's history, not merely for the crimes committed, but for what they reveal about the society that produced him. Raised in a culture that assigned monetary value to human beings, Elijah ultimately adopted the same worldview, even as he rebelled against his father's control. His plan to purchase freedom through the sale of others reveals the moral corruption inherent in the system itself. Historians examining the case have drawn particular attention to the psychological dimensions of Elijah's behavior. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, in her 1972 study, Possession and Identity in Antebellum Charleston, argues that Elijah's actions represent an extreme manifestation of the dehumanization inherent in the slave-owning culture of the American South. What makes the Harrington case so disturbing, Simmons writes, is not merely the calculated nature of Elijah's crimes, but his inability to recognize the parallel between his father's treatment of him as an asset to be leveraged for business advantage and his own treatment of those he sold. In his mind, his suffering at his father's hands justified actions that caused far greater suffering to others. This analysis finds support in Elijah's own words. His journal contains numerous passages lamenting his father's control while displaying complete indifference to the humanity of those he exploited. In one particularly revealing entry from August 1839, he writes, "Father sees me as property, an extension of the Harrington name and fortune rather than a man with desires and dreams of his own. I find this intolerable. Yet how simple it is to convert actual property into the means of my escape. 12 lives translate to freedom for one. The mathematics of liberation is cold, but effective." Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that Elijah, having failed to secure Margaret's willing participation in his scheme, simply replaced her with someone who could be purchased, the ultimate extension of the belief that everything and everyone has its price. In this reading of events, Elijah did not escape the system his father represented, but merely repositioned himself within it, exchanging one form of ownership for another. The case has particular resonance for modern historians studying the complex interplay between personal morality and social systems. Elijah's journals reveal a man who could eloquently critique his father's treatment of him as property, while failing to extend that same moral reasoning to those he himself exploited. Dr. James Peterson, in his 2010 book, The Economics of Identity: Case Studies in American Self-Making, places the Harrington story within a broader context of how wealth derived from human bondage shaped not just economics, but psychology. Elijah Harrington represents an individual case of a much larger phenomenon, Peterson argues. Having been raised in a system where human beings could be bought and sold, where identity itself was a commodity, he internalized these values even as he rebelled against them. His tragedy, and Margaret Thornton's, was that he could imagine freedom only within the framework of ownership. The fates of the 12 individuals whose sale financed Elijah's escape remain largely unknown. Historical researchers have attempted to trace their movements through plantation records and sale documents, but the deliberate destruction of evidence and the nature of the domestic slave trade have made this nearly impossible. One exception emerged in 1974, when a family history project in Natchez, Mississippi, uncovered records relating to a woman named Sarah, who had been purchased from a Charleston trader in September 1839. Oral history within the family that eventually inherited the plantation where she worked included accounts of Sarah speaking about being sold away from her husband and children on a plantation outside Charleston. While impossible to confirm definitively, the timing and circumstances suggest she may have been one of the 12 sold by Elijah. The Harrington mansion on East Bay Street still stands, though it has changed hands many times over the decades. Now functioning as a museum of Charleston history, tour guides point out its architectural features and mention its famous residents, though the full story of Elijah Harrington is rarely included in their narratives. Visitors to St. Philip's Churchyard sometimes notice a simple marker in the Thornton family plot, added in 1966. It bears only a name, Margaret Thornton, and the dates 1819, 1839. Fresh flowers occasionally appear on the grave, left by those who have researched the case and been moved by the story of a young woman whose rejection of complicity may have cost her life. For scholars of American history, the Harrington case serves as a stark reminder of how systems of oppression corrupt not just their most obvious beneficiaries, but also those who imagine themselves as rebels against such systems. Elijah's failure was not simply one of morality, but of imagination. He could envision freedom for himself, but only within the framework of ownership that had shaped his understanding of the world. As night falls over Charleston Harbor, the old houses stand in silence, their facades maintained while their histories are sanitized for public consumption. But in archives and forgotten records, in journals and letters yellowed with age, the true stories remain, waiting for those who dare to look beyond the columns in Spanish moss to the human cost of wealth built on ownership and lives valued by their price at auction. The merchant's son who sold his father's slaves to buy a bride never found redemption or escape. Like his father before him, he merely found new ways to possess what could never truly be owned, another person's life and liberty.